The sun bled out across the plains, painting the sky in shades of rust and fire. Long, skeletal shadows stretched from the weathered boards of the ranch house, and in the distance 5 riders moved through the tall grass. They were dark figures against the dying light, specters of judgment riding in on the evening tide. At their head, a man in a black coat sat tall in his saddle, his face a mask of cold granite. Judge Mason Hayes. His hand rested on the butt of his pistol, his eyes sweeping over the property like a hawk sizing up its prey. "Clara!" His voice wasn't a call. It was a command, sharp enough to cut the air. "I know you're in there. You can't hide forever." On the porch, Ethan Sullivan stood his ground. His shoulders were squared, his feet planted on the worn planks his father had laid down decades ago. The setting sun caught in his eyes, turning them to burning coals. His own hand hovered just inches from his revolver, a silent promise of violence. "This is my land, Hayes," he called out, his voice steady, betraying none of the thunder in his chest. "Turn your horses and ride out, now." Hayes let out a brittle laugh that sounded like rocks grinding together. "You're harboring a fugitive, Sullivan. My wife, a disturbed woman who needs to come home." Behind Ethan, the cabin door creaked open. A pale face appeared in the shadows. It was Clara, her dark hair a wild frame around features that had only just begun to lose their haunted look. Her eyes found Mason's, and the fear that had lived there for so long was replaced by something else, something hard and unyielding. "I'm not going back," she said, her voice carrying across the yard, clear as a bell. "Not ever." Mason's cruel smile vanished. His hand dropped to his gun with a speed that spoke of long practice. "Then I'll just have to—" The crack of a gunshot ripped through the evening. But it wasn't the shot you were expecting. To understand what happened on that porch, we have to go back. 2 months back, to a day that started like any other. Ethan Sullivan was riding the dusty trail toward home, his mind a checklist of chores. Fence posts to replace, feed to buy, the endless cycle of work that was both his prison and his salvation. It kept him busy. It kept him from thinking about Sarah. 5 years gone, and the silence in his cabin was still a living thing, a ghost that walked the floorboards at night. He remembered her last words, a whispered plea to fetch the doctor, a man 2 days' ride away. The fever had been faster. After she died, Ethan learned to live with the quiet. He measured his life in sunrises and sunsets, in the mending of things that were broken. That's all there was, until his horse's ears pricked forward. Ethan's eyes snapped to the trail ahead. There by an old bleached mile marker was a shape that didn't belong, a figure slumped against the post, half hidden by sagebrush. He thought it was a traveler resting, but as he drew closer, he saw the unnatural stillness of the form. It was a woman. Her dress was a faded green, torn at the hem and stained with dust and something dark that looked like blood. Her hands were clutched at her stomach, as if she were trying to hold herself together. Ethan reined in, his hand instinctively resting near his gun. "Out here, you learned caution before kindness." "Ma'am," he called out, "you all right?" Her head turned, a slow, pained movement. In the slanting light, he saw her face. Young, maybe 30, with features that might have been beautiful before fear carved its lines into her skin. But it was her eyes that struck him. They weren't pleading for help. They were bruised and weary, the eyes of someone who had stopped expecting kindness from the world long ago. When she spoke, her voice was a raw whisper, scraped dry from screaming or silence. "He broke them," she breathed. "I think my ribs are broken." Ethan dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, the way you'd approach a spooked colt. She flinched as he got closer, pressing herself against the post. But she didn't run, couldn't run. Up close, he could see the ugly mottling of bruises at her neckline, dark blossoms of purple and yellow that told a story of their own. This wasn't a fall from a horse. This was something else. This was the work of a man. He crouched down, keeping a respectful distance. "Name's Ethan Sullivan," he said, his voice low and steady. "Got a ranch about 3 miles from here. I can get you there, get you fixed up." She just stared at him, her eyes searching his face for a trick, for the lie behind the offer. Her shoes were worn through, her ankle raw and scraped. She'd been walking for a long, long time. "How far you come?" he asked gently. She just shook her head, her gaze darting back down the trail as if expecting monsters to appear over the rise. "I can walk," she murmured, but the tremble in her legs said otherwise. "No need," Ethan said. He stood and reached for her, moving slow. He half expected her to pull away, to fight, but she didn't. He lifted her into his saddle, her body shockingly light, and swung up behind her. His arms formed a loose circle around her as he took the reins, giving her space to breathe. They rode in silence, the only sound the steady beat of hooves on the dry earth. He could feel the fine tremors running through her, not from the cold, but from a pain that went deeper than broken bones. Just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, she spoke a single word, her voice barely a whisper against the wind. "Clara." "Rest easy, Clara," Ethan said, though she couldn't see him nod. "Not far now." His ranch was a simple affair, a small weathered cabin, a sturdy barn, and a corral. It was isolated, 15 miles to the nearest neighbor. It was a place a person could disappear, a place where no one would ask questions you didn't want to answer. He helped her down and led her inside. The cabin was dim, lit by a single oil lamp. It was simple, but it was clean. A narrow bed in the corner, a rough-hewn table, a stone hearth. Clara stood in the middle of the room, her eyes darting from the bed to the door, mapping out escape routes she didn't have the strength to use. "Sit," he said, and she obeyed, sinking into a chair with a wince of pain. He brought her water, and then a clean shirt of his own, faded and soft from 100 washings. He laid it on the back of a chair. "Yours is torn," he said simply. "This'll do till it's mended." Her eyes flickered up to his, startled by the simple act of decency. He busied himself at the stove, heating water, giving her space. He could feel her gaze on him, watching, weighing. When the water was hot, he brought it to her with clean strips of cloth. "I need to see how bad those ribs are," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Can't help if I don't know what's broke." She hesitated, her hand tightening over her side. Then with a slow, deliberate nod, she whispered, "Turn around." He faced the wall, listening to the rustle of fabric. When he turned back, she had wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, leaving her bruised torso exposed. The sight made his jaw clench. The bruises were a constellation of violence, a map of cruelty. Some were old, faded to a sickly yellow. Others were a fresh, angry purple. This hadn't happened all at once. This was the work of weeks, maybe months. "He was careful," she murmured, as if reading his thoughts. "Never where it would show." Ethan didn't ask who he was. You didn't need a name for a monster. He just cleaned the scrapes and gently wound the cloths around her ribs, binding the hurt, giving her support so she could breathe a little easier. Later, as darkness fell, he stood on the porch, listening to the whisper of the wind in the tall grass. He had left her a plate of stew and bread on the table. He didn't know if she would eat. He didn't know her story. All he knew was that trouble had washed up on his doorstep, wearing a woman's face. He had spent 5 years shutting the world out, living with his ghosts. Now a new one was sleeping in his bed, and he had a feeling this one had brought other, more dangerous ghosts along with her. The next morning, Ethan woke on his pallet by the cold stove and found Clara already awake. She was at the table slicing a loaf of bread, each movement slow and deliberate, her face tight with pain. She was wearing his shirt. It hung on her small frame, the sleeves rolled to her elbows. She had tried to tie her tangled hair back. It was a small act of reclaiming herself, and it struck him more than any words could have. "You shouldn't be straining," he said, setting down a pail of fresh milk. "I'm not useless," she answered, the words sharp, defensive. She wouldn't meet his eyes. He didn't argue. He just poured her a mug of coffee and set it on the table. He understood. Sometimes the only way to fight the pain inside was to do something, anything, to prove you were still alive. The day passed in a strange, silent rhythm. He mended a fence, and he could feel her watching him from the cabin window. When he came back for water, she was sweeping the floor, her movements stiff but determined. He didn't stop her. He knew this wasn't about the dust on the floorboards. It was about sweeping away the helplessness. That afternoon, he found her on the porch steps, staring out at the rolling hills. She didn't look at him when she spoke. "He told me I was clumsy," she said, her voice flat, "that I bruised easily. He said it so many times I started to believe it." Ethan leaned against the porch post, his arms folded. He said nothing. He just listened. That was something he was good at. "He liked the quiet," she continued, "my quiet. He said a woman's voice should be soft, unobtrusive. After a while, I just stopped talking much at all." She finally looked at him, her eyes searching his. "You don't ask many questions. Folks out here have a right to their own stories," he said. "Tell them when they're ready." A faint, disbelieving smile touched her lips. "No one's ever said that to me before." That night something shifted. The silence between them was no longer heavy and awkward. It was comfortable, companionable. After dinner, he was mending a bridle by the lamplight, and she was still at the table, just watching him. In the middle of the night, he woke to the sound of movement. He sat up, instantly alert. Clara was standing by the door, her hand on the frame, silhouetted by the moonlight. She was just staring out into the darkness. "You all right?" he asked softly. She didn't turn. "Just checking the door," she whispered, making sure it wasn't locked. "It's never locked," he said. She stayed there for a long time, as if drinking in the open space, the possibility of escape. Then she turned and sat in the chair by the window, pulling a blanket around her shoulders. She was keeping watch. Ethan didn't press her to go back to bed. He stoked the fire, adding another log, and sat in the chair across from her. The moon cast long shadows across the floor, and the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. "My wife," he said suddenly, his voice rough. "Sarah, she died in that bed." Clara's head turned toward him, her eyes wide in the dim light. "Fever," he continued, staring at his own calloused hands. "Came on fast. By the time I realized how bad it was too late. I should have gone for the doctor sooner." The guilt was an old friend, a familiar weight in his chest. Clara's voice was soft in the darkness. "You couldn't have known." "I should have," he insisted, his jaw tight. "She trusted me to take care of her, and I failed." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Some things can't be stopped, no matter how hard you try. Some people, they're like a fever. They get inside you and burn you from the inside out. It's not your fault you couldn't save her, any more than it was my fault that—" She trailed off, but he understood. In that quiet, moonlit room, two broken people saw their own pain reflected in the other's eyes. And for the first time in a long time, neither of them felt completely alone. But as the sun rose the next morning, Ethan knew something else. Clara's past wasn't just a fever she had survived. It was a storm, and it was heading straight for his ranch. He just didn't know how bad it was going to be. The days that followed fell into a fragile routine. Clara grew stronger. The bruises faded, and a little color returned to her cheeks. She took over the cooking, her movements becoming more fluid, less pained. He even heard her humming once, a low, sad tune that stopped the moment she realized he was listening. He found himself watching her, the way she tucked a stray piece of hair behind her ear, the way her brow furrowed in concentration as she mended his torn shirt. He was noticing things again. It had been a long time since he'd noticed anything but the work. One evening, he was in the barn sorting tools when he heard the sound of a horse approaching. He stepped outside, shading his eyes against the setting sun. It was a lone rider, and the black coat and wide-brimmed hat told him it was Reverend Roberts from the church in town. Ethan felt a knot of unease tighten in his stomach. The Reverend rarely came this far out. His visits usually meant one of two things: a death or trouble. Ethan glanced toward the cabin. Clara was standing in the doorway, her body rigid, her knuckles white where she gripped the doorframe. She looked like a deer that had scented a wolf on the wind. "Evening, Reverend," Ethan called out, deliberately positioning himself between the rider and the cabin. Reverend Roberts dismounted. He was a tall, stern man with eyes that seemed to see right through you. "Sullivan," he said with a nod. "Been a while since you graced my church with your presence." "Been busy," Ethan said flatly. The truth was, he hadn't found much comfort in prayer since Sarah died. The Reverend's gaze flickered past him toward the shadow in the doorway. "Heard you had company," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "News travels fast in empty country." "Just helping someone out," Ethan said, keeping his voice even. "So I hear," the Reverend said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "There's talk, Sullivan, talk from Oakage County, about a woman who ran from her husband, a very important man, Judge Mason Hayes." Ethan's face remained a mask, but inside his blood ran cold. A judge, of course. It explained the fear, the careful cruelty of the bruises. "Don't know anything about that, Reverend," he lied. Robert studied him for a long, heavy moment. "The Lord sees all our business, son. Even the business we try to keep hidden out here on the plains." He glanced at the cabin again. "Harboring a runaway wife is a serious matter, against the law of God and the law of man." "The law?" Ethan repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "Sometimes the law ain't the same as what's right." The Reverend sighed, a sound that might have been regret. "Just be careful. Judge Hayes is not a man to be crossed." He swung back onto his horse. "Tell the woman, tell her she is welcome at my services. If she wishes to seek God's forgiveness." Ethan watched him ride away, a pillar of dust rising in his wake. Forgiveness? For what? For running for her life? He turned back to the cabin. Clara had retreated inside. He found her sitting at the table, her face ashen, all the color and life of the past week drained away. She looked just as she had the day he found her. Hunted. "He knows," she whispered, her hands trembling in her lap. "They all know." Ethan closed the door, shutting out the dying light. "Know what, Clara? Tell me everything." And she did. The story came out in a torrent, a flood of pain and fear held back for too long. She had married Judge Mason Hayes 3 years ago. Her younger sister Emma had been sick, and Mason, a respected, wealthy pillar of the community, had offered to pay for her care. He had seemed like a savior, a gentleman. After the wedding, that changed. First it was small things, a criticism about the food, a sharp word about her dress, control. Then came the anger, a plate thrown against the wall, a backhanded slap in the privacy of their bedroom. The first time he had cried, begged her forgiveness, sworn it would never happen again. "But it did," Ethan said, his voice a low growl. She nodded, her eyes fixed on the tabletop. "It got worse. He was so careful, always where the bruises wouldn't show. He told me I was frail, that I was imagining things. He told everyone I was. Delicate, prone to hysterics." A bitter smile twisted her lips. "The wife of Judge Hayes. Who would believe me over him?" So she endured it, until 3 weeks ago. "I saw something," she whispered, her voice dropping so low he had to lean in to hear. "A neighbor, Adam Weber. He and Mason were arguing over water rights. I heard shouting from the barn. I looked. Mason had him on his knees. He was hitting him with the silver handle of his riding crop. Over and over. There was so much blood." Ethan felt the floor drop out from under him. This was more than abuse. This was murder. "He saw me," she continued, her breath hitching. "He saw me watching from the house that night. That night was the worst. He broke my ribs. He told me if I ever told anyone, he would have me committed to an asylum. He'd say the murder was another one of my hysterical fantasies. He said he'd make sure I never saw the light of day again." So she ran, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a body full of pain. She ran until she couldn't run anymore, until she collapsed by that mile marker. She looked up at him then, her eyes wide with a desperate plea. "I'm not crazy, Ethan. I know what I saw." "I believe you," he said, the two words as solid as the stone hearth behind him. Tears welled in her eyes, tears she refused to let fall. "You're the first person who has." Ethan stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the darkening plains. The Reverend's warning echoed in his ears. "Judge Hayes is not a man to be crossed. A man who murders to protect his secrets wouldn't hesitate to do it again. And now that man knew where to find the only witness to his crime. The trouble Ethan had feared wasn't on its way. It had already arrived. And it was wearing a judge's robes. A week passed. Then another. A fragile peace settled over the ranch, the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. Ethan and Clara existed in a state of suspended reality, both knowing Hayes would come, but neither speaking of it. The unspoken truth hung in the air between them, a constant, low hum of dread. Clara's physical wounds began to heal. The bruises faded, her breathing eased. But the fear remained, a shadow in her eyes that never quite disappeared. She took on more chores around the cabin, as if trying to build a wall of normalcy around herself. She cooked. She mended. She even started a small garden by the porch steps, digging in the hard-packed earth with a stubborn determination. "This place could use some color," she'd said, when he asked what she was doing. He knew she wasn't just talking about flowers. Ethan watched her, an unfamiliar feeling stirring in his chest. It was more than pity. It was admiration. He saw the strength beneath her fear, the resilience in the way she moved. He found himself looking for her smile, a rare, fleeting thing that transformed her face and made him feel something he hadn't felt in 5 long years. One morning, he was fixing a loose board on the porch, and she brought him a dipper of cool water from the well. Their fingers brushed as he took it. The touch was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through him. He looked up and met her eyes, and for a second, the fear was gone, replaced by something else, something warm and uncertain. The illusion of peace shattered the day they rode into town for supplies. Mill Creek wasn't much more than a wide spot in the road, a handful of buildings baking in the sun. But to Clara, it must have felt like a city. She rode beside his wagon, her back straight, her eyes scanning every shadow, every doorway. She wore her mended green dress and a faded bonnet, trying to be invisible. But in a town this small, a new face was an event. Heads turned, conversations stopped. Whispers followed them like burrs on a blanket. Inside the general store, the air was thick with unspoken questions. Mrs. Carver, the owner, a woman with eyes that missed nothing, greeted Ethan warmly but studied Clara with a sharp curiosity. As they gathered their supplies, 2 women entered, their gossip cutting off the moment they saw Clara. They huddled in a corner, their whispers just loud enough to carry. "The judge's wife ran off. They say she's not right in the head." Ethan saw Clara flinch, her shoulders tightening. He finished his business quickly, his jaw clenched. As they stepped back out onto the boardwalk, a young man leaning against a post straightened up. He was tall and lanky, with a jagged scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. He nodded to Ethan, but his eyes were on Clara. "Ma'am," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "You all right?" The simple, direct question seemed to startle her. She looked at him, and for the first time that day, the hunted look in her eyes softened. "I am now," she said, a faint smile touching her lips. The young man, Thomas Wells, the blacksmith's apprentice, met her gaze. Something passed between them, a silent understanding of shared pain. He knew what a bully's hand felt like. As they loaded the wagon, Mrs. Carver hurried out of the store. "A moment," she called, her face grave. She came to Clara's side of the wagon, her voice a low murmur. "I knew I recognized you. You're Emma Fleming's sister." Clara went rigid. "You knew my sister, Emma?" Mrs. Carver nodded, her eyes sad. "She passed through here last year, worked at the hotel for a week to earn her passage west. She told me about you, about the judge, about the bruises she saw." Clara's hand flew to her mouth. Is she all right?" A shadow crossed Mrs. Carver's face. "I'm sorry, dear. Word came back a few months ago. They said she took her own life in Carson City." The color drained from Clara's face. "No," she whispered. "No, she wouldn't." "She left this for you," Mrs. Carver said, pressing a small, paper-wrapped parcel into Clara's trembling hands. "She said if her sister ever came looking, I was to give it to her." She leaned closer, her voice dropping even lower. "There's more. The judge is offering a reward for you, and they found Adam Weber's body, buried in a shallow grave on the judge's land. The official story is suicide." She shook her head. "No one with any sense believes it." They rode out of town in a stunned silence. Clara clutched the package to her chest, her face a mask of grief and shock. "Emma, gone." It didn't make sense. Emma was the strong one, the fighter. Halfway back to the ranch, Clara finally tore open the package. Inside was a small leather-bound journal and a folded letter. Her hands shook as she read the letter first. She knew, Clara said, her voice hollow. She knew he'd come after her. She writes, "If you are reading this, Clara, it means Mason has found me. Do not believe the story they tell you. I would never leave you willingly." Murdered. Her sister had been murdered. And this journal, it was Emma's handwriting, page after page detailing every incident Clara had ever told her about. Dates, injuries, threats. Emma had been gathering evidence. This wasn't just a diary, it was a weapon her sister had died to protect. "This is why he's hunting you," Ethan said, the pieces clicking into place. "It's not just because you're a witness to Weber's murder. It's because of this journal. It proves everything." Clara looked up from the pages, her eyes burning with a new fire. The grief was still there, but it was being forged into something else, something hard and sharp. "He didn't just take my life from me," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "He took my sister. He's not going to get away with it." Ethan looked at the woman beside him. The broken, fragile creature he had found by the side of the road was gone. In her place was someone else, a survivor, a fighter. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would stand between her and the devil himself if he had to. The storm hadn't passed. It had just been gathering strength, and now it was about to break right over their heads. The journal changed everything. It was no longer just Clara's word against a powerful judge. It was a testament, written in her sister's hand, a voice from the grave crying out for justice. They spent that night reading it by lamplight, each entry a fresh horror. Emma had documented every bruise, every threat, every lie Mason had told. She'd even included a signed statement from a doctor in Carson City who had treated Clara for fall-related injuries during a visit, with a private note questioning the nature of the wounds. Emma had been building a case. She had been preparing for war. "She was trying to save you," Ethan said, closing the book. The weight of it seemed to fill the small cabin. "And it got her killed," Clara whispered, tracing her sister's name on the cover. "She left it with Mrs. Carver for safekeeping. Insurance. In case Mason ever came after her." And he had. Now Ethan understood the urgency. Hayes wasn't just looking for a runaway wife. He was hunting for the one thing that could destroy him, and he would stop at nothing to get it back. The very next afternoon he came. He didn't bring deputies or a posse. He came alone, riding up to the gate as if he were paying a social call. He was tall and handsome, his smile as bright and cold as winter sun. Seeing him, Ethan understood how Clara could have been fooled. The monster wore a gentleman's face. "Clara, my love," he called out, his voice smooth as polished stone. "It's time to end this foolish game and come home." Clara had stepped onto the porch with Ethan. Her body went rigid, but she didn't hide behind him. She stood her ground, her chin held high. "This is my home now, Mason," she said, her voice clear and steady. Hayes' smile tightened. His gaze flickered to Ethan, dismissing him as nothing more than a farmhand. "I see you found a protector. A noble, if misguided gesture, but my wife is unwell. She suffers from delusions. I have a doctor's report to prove it." "The only delusion was thinking you were a good man," Ethan said, his hand resting on the gate. "She's not going with you." The pretense of civility dropped from Hayes' face, revealing the ugliness beneath. "She is my property," he hissed, "and I will have what is mine." He looked past Ethan, his eyes locking on Clara. "I know about the journal, Clara. Emma was a fool to think she could stand against me, just as you are a fool. Give it to me, and I might be lenient. I might let your farmer friend here live." It was a mistake. The threat against Ethan ignited the last of Clara's fear into pure rage. "You will never touch it," she said, "and you will never touch him." Hayes' hand moved toward the gun on his hip, but he was too far away, and he knew it. He was testing them. He smiled that cold, dead smile again. "This isn't over," he said, pulling on his reins. "I'll be back, with the law on my side, and when I return, I will take my wife, and I will take this land. I will burn everything you love to the ground." He rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy silence in his wake. Clara was trembling, but not from fear. It was fury. He won't stop, she said. He'll get a warrant. He'll turn the law itself into his weapon. Then we need to be ready, Ethan said. They had the journal, but a book wasn't enough. They needed people. They needed allies. That night, Ethan rode for town under the cover of darkness. He went straight to the blacksmith's shop, where a light still burned. He found Thomas Wells hammering a glowing piece of steel on his anvil. He told him everything. About the journal, about the murder, about Hayes's threat. Thomas listened, his face grim. When Ethan was done, he set down his hammer and looked at his own scarred face in a shard of broken mirror. My stepfather, he said, his voice low. He was a man like Hayes, thought his fists made him king of his own home. One night, he went after my mother. I stepped in between. He laid my face open with his belt buckle. He touched the scar, but he never touched her again, and he left town the next day. Sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to stand up to him, no matter the cost. Thomas told him something else, something that made Ethan's blood run cold. His mother had a cousin who worked as a clerk at the courthouse in Oakage. The clerk had sent a letter. The doctor who had questioned Adam Weber's autopsy, Dr. Merritt, had died a week ago. A sudden heart attack, they said. But he was a healthy man, and the night before he died, his office had been broken into. Hayes was cleaning up loose ends. He was erasing anyone who could corroborate Clara's story. He's not just a murderer, Thomas said. He's a damn disease, and he's spreading. He walked to a locked chest in the corner and pulled out a revolver, clean and well-oiled. You'll need this, he said, pressing it into Ethan's hand. And you need to get the Reverend on your side. He's a stern man, but he's a just one. Make him listen. When Ethan got back to the ranch, the moon was high. Clara was waiting on the porch, a rifle across her knees. The sight of her, so fierce and determined, stirred something deep inside him. He told her what he'd learned. The news about Dr. Merritt settled heavily between them. Hayes wasn't just coming for the journal anymore. He was coming to silence them for good. We could run, Clara said, her voice small. Go west, like Emma tried to. Ethan looked at her, at the small home he had built with his own two hands, the land that held Sarah's memory. He looked at the woman who had brought life back into his silent world. Hayes had threatened to burn everything he loved to the ground. And in that moment, Ethan realized that everything he loved was right here on this porch. No, he said, his voice firm. We don't run. We make our stand. Right here. Clara looked at him, a question in her eyes. Why? She asked. Why are you doing this? You could have just turned me away. He thought for a moment, the answer forming in his heart before it reached his lips. Because I spent 5 years letting the past haunt me, he said, living in a house full of ghosts. You're the first thing in a long time that's felt alive. I'm not going to let him take that from me, from us. He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was strong. In the pale moonlight, he saw that the woman on the porch was no longer a victim. She was a warrior, and this ranch wasn't just a refuge anymore. It was a fortress, and they were about to face the siege of their lives. They didn't have to wait long. The next day was a Sunday. Following Thomas's advice, they rode into town for church. It was a risk, but it was a calculated one. They needed to show the town they weren't hiding. They needed to force the Reverend Roberts to choose a side. The church was half full. As they walked in, a hush fell over the congregation. People stared, some with sympathy, some with suspicion. Ethan saw a stranger near the back, a man with cold eyes and a suit that didn't belong in Mill Creek, one of Hayes's men. They were being watched. Reverend Roberts' sermon that day was about false prophets, about wolves in sheep's clothing, about men who used power and position to prey on the weak. His eyes seemed to bore right into Ethan and Clara, and then to the stranger in the back. He was speaking in code, and everyone in the room knew it. After the service, the Reverend approached them. You were brave to come, he said, his stern face unreadable. We came to ask for your help, Clara said, her voice clear and strong. She held out Emma's journal. This is the truth, Reverend, the truth about what Judge Hayes did to me and to my sister. The Reverend took the journal. He was silent for a long time as he flipped through the pages. When he looked up, there was a deep sadness in his eyes. 20 years ago, he said, his voice heavy with regret. "A woman came to me. Her husband was a respected man in town. She told me stories much like these. I told her to pray, to be a better wife. A week later, she was dead. They called it an accident." He closed the journal and handed it back to Clara. "I will not make that mistake again. God forgive me, I will not." Just then, the stranger from the back of the church started walking toward them. The Reverend stepped in front of Clara and Ethan. "This is a house of God, sir," he said, his voice booming. "You are not welcome here." The man hesitated, then turned and left, a sneer on his face. The town had chosen its side, but it was too late. The man would go back to Hayes. He would tell him about the journal, about the Reverend, about the town's support. Hayes would know he could no longer rely on whispers and legal tricks. He would come with fire and guns. As they rode back to the ranch, the sky began to darken. A storm was rolling in from the west. The air grew heavy, charged with electricity. It was a mirror of the tension coiling in their chests. That night the storm broke. Rain lashed against the windows and thunder shook the small cabin. Ethan and Clara sat by the fire, the journal on the table between them. They were no longer just a rancher and a refugee. They were partners. Soldiers preparing for a battle they knew was coming. "He'll come at dawn," Ethan said, checking the loads in his revolver and the one Thomas had given him. Clara nodded, her face pale in the firelight, but her eyes resolute. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said, and she meant it. The fear had been burned out of her, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. In the midst of the storm's fury, Ethan looked at her, at this woman who had walked out of the wilderness and into his life, and he knew he would die for her. But he planned on living. He planned on building a life with her, right here, on this land, after the storm passed. "When this is over," he said, his voice low, "I want you to stay, not as a guest, as my wife." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but this time they were not tears of pain. "Yes," she whispered as thunder cracked overhead. "Yes." The dawn came, gray and washed clean by the storm, and with it they came. 5 riders with Judge Hayes at their head. But this time, something was different. Ethan and Clara stood on the porch, armed and ready. But they weren't alone. As Hayes and his men rode into the yard, another rider appeared on the ridge behind them. It was Thomas Wells. And then another. And another. Men from the town, ranchers from the neighboring properties. They came on horseback, carrying rifles, their faces grim and determined. At their head was the Reverend Roberts, his black coat flapping in the wind, looking more like a warrior than a preacher. Hayes pulled up short, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. His small posse was now facing a small army. "This is my private business," he roared. "This woman is a member of my congregation," the Reverend called back, his voice booming across the yard. "Her business is my business, and the business of this town." For the first time, Ethan saw a flicker of doubt in Hayes's eyes. His power, his influence meant nothing out here. This wasn't his courtroom. This was a different kind of justice. But the judge was a cornered animal, and that made him more dangerous than ever. He saw the journal in Clara's hands. "That book belongs to me," he screamed, his voice cracking. He drew his pistol, but he didn't aim at Ethan. He aimed at Clara. He never fired the shot. 2 things happened at once. Ethan threw himself in front of Clara, a human shield, and a rifle shot cracked from the line of riders. Hayes cried out, clutching his shoulder as his pistol fell to the mud. Thomas Wells lowered his smoking rifle, his face set like stone. Hayes's men looked from their wounded boss to the dozen rifles now aimed at them, and they slowly raised their hands in the air. It was over, just like that. The siege had ended before it truly began. The town had stood up to the bully. Justice hadn't been found in a courtroom. It had been delivered in the muddy yard of a small remote ranch. As Marshal Burns and his deputies, who had been alerted by the Reverend and were only minutes behind, rode in to take Hayes into custody, Ethan pulled Clara close. Her face was buried in his chest, her shoulders shaking with the release of 1,000 held-back tears. He looked over her head at the faces of his neighbors, these quiet, stoic men who had risked everything to stand with them. He saw Mrs. Carver arriving in her wagon, her face beaming. He saw the Reverend, who gave him a solemn nod. "It's over," Ethan whispered into Clara's hair. "It's really over." She looked up at him, her eyes red but shining. The haunted look was gone forever. "No," she said, a slow smile spreading across her face. "It's just beginning." She looked at the small patch of turned earth by the porch, where the first green shoots of her wildflowers were pushing through the rain-soaked soil. After the storm, after the fire, life was already beginning to grow again. The trial of Judge Mason Hayes was the talk of the territory, with the discovery of Adam Weber's hidden documents, proving the judge's widespread land fraud, and the testimony of a dozen new witnesses who finally felt safe enough to come forward. The case was airtight. The slick lawyer from the Capitol couldn't protect him. The web of lies and intimidation he had woven for years unraveled in a matter of days. He was found guilty. Guilty of murder, of corruption, of the attempted murder of his wife. A wife who was no longer his. Clara Sullivan stood in the courtroom and watched as they led him away in chains. She felt no triumph, no thirst for revenge, just a quiet, profound relief. The ghost that had haunted her for so long was finally laid to rest. She felt a strong hand take hers and she looked up into Ethan's warm eyes. "Let's go home," he said. And they did. They went back to the ranch that was no longer a fortress, but a sanctuary. Their wedding was a simple affair, held right there on the porch, with the whole town in attendance. Reverend Roberts performed the ceremony, his voice thick with emotion. Thomas Wells was Ethan's best man, the scar on his face a testament to the kind of courage that had brought them all together. Clara wore a simple white dress Mrs. Carver had sewn for her, and in her hair she wore the first blossoms from her garden. Wildflowers. Stubborn and beautiful, they had bloomed in the hard-packed earth, a riot of color and life. Years passed. The ranch thrived. The silence that had once filled the cabin was replaced by the sound of laughter. First Clara's, then Ethan's, and then a few years later, the laughter of a small boy with his father's steady eyes and his mother's resilient smile. They named him Samuel after Ethan's father, but his middle name was a tribute to the sister who had given her life to save his mother's. Samuel Emma Sullivan. Sometimes on quiet evenings, Clara would stand on the porch and look out at the rolling hills, at the endless sky painted with the colors of the sunset. She would touch the faint, silvery scars on her ribs, a map of a life she had barely survived, and she would feel a profound sense of gratitude for the man who had found her broken on the side of the road and had seen not a victim, but a survivor, for the community that had stood up against the darkness, and for the simple, extraordinary gift of a second chance. She had found more than safety in this place. She had found her voice. She had found her strength. She had found her home. The story of the rancher and the judge's wife became a local legend, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, courage can take root in the most unlikely places. A reminder that sometimes the only law that matters is the one that's written on the human heart. And a reminder that even after the most brutal storm, wildflowers can and will bloom again. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe, because you never know what tales of survival and justice are waiting just over the next ridge.